NCORE is committed to fostering an atmosphere that encourages the free expression and exchange of ideas.
In pursuit of that ideal,
NCORE is committed to the promotion of equality of opportunity and treatment for all NCORE participants in NCORE-sponsored events,
regardless of gender,
gender identity or expression,
race,
color,
national or ethnic origin,
religion or religious belief,
Age,
marital status,
sexual orientation,
immigration status,
disabilities,
veteran status,
or body size.
Start the conversation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman for our monthly webinar series. I am Dr. Jane Irungu, the Executive Director of the Center and Director of NCORE, and I'm delighted to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, NCORE offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesday. Our Emerging Scholars webinars are held on the first Wednesday, and they focus on ideas that speak directly to the experiences of students. These webinars are either facilitated or co-facilitated by a student and are intended to identify emerging scholars. These are always available at no cost. In October, we have scheduled 3 webinars, and today's webinar was supposed to happen in August, but we had to reschedule due to circumstances beyond our control. Our next webinar will be presented on October 28th, Race, Class, and Media, Teaching Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Media and Communication Studies with Dr. Meta Kastafen of the University of Oklahoma Gaylord College of Journalism. This is one that you don't want to miss. Please visit our website, www.ncore.ou.edu, for the full list of featured webinars for this season. We would like to ask you to use the chat box to tell us where you're watching us from. Also tweet, Instagram, or share with the hashtag NCORE Start the Conversation online. It is incredibly important for us to stay connected, especially during these uncertain times. Today we have Dr. Claire Verama Wallace. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Nursing at California State University, East Bay, where she teaches community health nursing, community engagement, and epidemiology and social inequities. We also have Dr. Angela Jones, assistant professor of supply chain management in the Howard University School of Business. She has published research on the consumer perceptions of retailer supply chain policies and procedures. Her teaching interests are supply chain management, logistics, and transportation management. We also have Dr. Ricardo Montelongo, is an assistant professor of higher education administration at Sam Houston State University. And Ricardo's primary research interests include college student involvement, the impact of Latino, Latinx college student organizations, diversity issues in higher education administration, campus environments, online learning, and digital pedagogy. Last but not least, we have Christina Marshall. She is the department chair of the Human Services Program for the Baker College System and the program director of social sciences, which includes the criminal justice program on the Flint and Owasso campuses. Christina earned her Juris Doctorate degree from Thomas M. Cooley Law School in Lansing, Michigan. She began teaching paralegal students who are working in the court system. Their topic today is multiple front lines, everything involved in what we call online learning. The center is very grateful for their expertise. Please post questions in the Q&A box and they will address them at the end of the presentation. Just a reminder that we also have closed captioning and we have ASL from Sorensen organization. I want to welcome Claire, Angela, Ricardo, and Christina. I'd like everybody to take a moment to read this land acknowledgement. We always ask our presenters to tell us where they are from and their lands for where their universities or organizations live. And today we have folks from Michigan, Washington, DC, California, and Texas. You can also chat in the chat box, include where you are from, and also acknowledge your lands. We have folks from Virginia, Washington, Texas. Maria is in the land of Monacan, Colorado, Illinois. Thank you all. It's very important for us to acknowledge those who were there before us. I will now shift the conversation and presentation to Dr. Christina Marshall.
So thank you, everyone, and thanks for your patience in this online environment. So I'm going to go over our objectives first. And so today we would like to talk to you about the impact of online learning for our students, as well as the impact for our faculty, as well as accreditation. And then we would like to leave you with some tools and strategies to help adjust to our new online environments. So let's look at the impact on our students. First, we want to look at the equity issues as it relates to how our students are interacting in our online environment. So poor internet infrastructure. We have to think about and understand that not all of our students have the same internet infrastructure now that they are working from their homes. So when we start to engage in our classes and hold synchronous classes, we need to maybe keep those things in mind. That number one, they may not have that same quality of bandwidth. Also during that synchronous time may not be convenient as it once was when they were on campuses, because now they may have children running around in the background, or they may have to share their devices with other siblings or other people in their homes, as well as I stated earlier, just the bandwidth itself. It may not support the students. We also want to look at how we support our students. How do we, in this online environment now, support our students with disabilities? How are we making sure that we're able to provide those accommodations, especially when we have some institutions that are not on ground at all? So even our disability support staff is also working remotely. How are we ensuring that we are meeting the needs of our students with those disabilities? One of the examples that I have is we currently had a couple of students who have accommodations in which it requires that the instructors see them face to face, along with some other accommodations. So in our traditional online classes, number one, the pace is 8 weeks in length. So that's much faster than our 16-week on-ground courses. And the other is, in our traditional online courses, they aren't able to see their instructors. We don't have the face-to-face synchronous modality as we do with our on-ground. So we have to think about how are we going to meet those needs. We also have to think about the economic hardships that our students now may be facing. So for example, our students may not have the same services that they had when they were on our campuses. They may not be able to access the same supplies that they once were when they're on campus. And they may not be able to purchase things that they once were, because now they're in a total different setting, being at home than being on our campus. So we want to look at all of the equity issues that our students are now facing in this online environment. We also want to look at the stress and the stress level of our students. Our students sometimes are mentally exhausted. Not that they weren't exhausted before, but now they're in their homes. They haven't gone out of their homes for most people since March. So they're mentally exhausted with their classes. They don't have the same type of interactions that they had when they were able to engage with one another on campus. They also may have different financial problems. Now that they are at home, they may be having to support other people. There's examples of students who, I had a few students who were the only people working in their household. So now they were working more hours to make sure that the rest of the people in their household were supported, and also having to pay for school outside of the financial aid that they were receiving. We have family issues now that we are experiencing COVID. We know that more people of color have a greater chance of experiencing or having COVID impact them and their families. So that, in addition to their schooling, they're having to think about, as well as now some people are having to take care, and some of our students are having to take care of family members. So not only are they doing their schooling, but they're also taking care of family members, or they're taking care of their children at home because their children may not be in school either. So there's a lot of impeding concentration that the students are going through that they may not have gone through when they were on campus. We also have these relationship silos, and that our students are not able to engage with their fellow students like they were when we were on ground. You can go and chat with each other after class. You can go and meet up at the coffee shop. And due to the current impact of COVID, not everyone is feeling comfortable going out and having those engagements. So how do we engage our students? We want to make sure that we are engaging our students, but how do we do that and make sure that with all these competing interests that we just talked about, how are we able to capture their interest? We want to make sure that when we're delivering our content, that is impactful to the students, that the students can still do some of the same things that they do in a face-to-face in an online environment. And we're going to talk about that later when we talk about our strategies and tools. And last but not least, we also want to make sure that we provide provide supportive accountability. So what do we mean by that? Many of us have no late policies. And so in this time that we're in, having a no late policy may not be something that we have to hold solid for our students. In other words, if there are extenuating circumstances, we may need to think about that. Maybe they get an extra 24 hours to turn that assignment in because they were helping their child with homework, they were helping their parent with all of the things that their parent may have needed. They were running around to the doctors with their grandparent, etc. So there's a lot more competing interests that the students have that they did not have before COVID happened. So we want to make sure that, yes, we want to hold our students accountable. We want to have the same economic rigor and relevance, but we also want to make sure that we're supportive and helping make sure that they're able to meet those goals and those standards and be successful. One of the things that we have learned a lot as we work with our students in our internships and their practicums and their clinicals is the need to be flexible as well as accountable. But one of the things that COVID has taught us all is the need to be flexible, the need to be understanding, the need to be compassionate. So as we continue on in our path in our online environments, those are some of the things we want to think about and how our students are impacted by COVID and now shifting to this online environment. So Angela, would you like to talk to us about the impact that COVID is having on our faculty?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. Good afternoon, everyone. In my segment, I'm going to be discussing the impact that this pandemic has had on faculty in particular from a teaching and research perspective. I'm first going to discuss some of the stressors that were experienced in the initial shift of our classrooms to more of a remote learning environment and some of the additional challenges that we have experienced as we've continued to navigate this new environment. I will then discuss some of the considerations for gender expectations related to teaching and research, and then specific concerns for tenure track faculty. So we can go on, and then now we're going to get into this first topic of discussing some of the stressors. So back in March, when many of us were first dealing with the shift in managing our classrooms remotely, we needed to quickly assess our technology needs and figure out how to transition to using technology for things that we were typically doing in person in the classroom. And of course, universities were no different than many corporations, where they really just weren't prepared for this type of an event or this type of a scenario where we would need to do this quick transition. And so they didn't necessarily have the right tools and training in place to hit the ground running. Many of us faced the need to go out and seek technology on our own to support our specific needs in managing our classrooms. And then alternatively, in some cases, we almost felt bombarded with being presented with many options to manage our classrooms with different tools and technologies. I recall that during this whirlwind time that I was trying to fit in many training sessions to use different types of technologies and understand the functionality of different tools that would help me to manage the classroom. And it became somewhat overwhelming, during this time of even trying to, quickly do this transition to a remote learning environment. And then, of course, for any new tools that we were using, there's a learning curve. And just getting up to speed with, the full functionality and how we actually use all of these different tools. There were especially challenges with managing courses that were very interactive. For example, some courses have a laboratory component where part of the learning experience involves students interacting with equipment. I know of some courses where students need to use specific software that's housed on the computers within a computer lab on campus. Just because of licensing, each student can't have their own license. So that certainly created a challenge for those types of courses. And then there are some courses where, just because of the nature of the topic, that it's just easier to facilitate in person, face-to-face. For example, I teach negotiations to business students, and I often use examples of exercises in class where students are negotiating face-to-face. So just figuring out how to do these things through the use of technology remotely was a challenge. I've heard other colleagues discuss even missing out on something basic like being able to use a whiteboard or a chalkboard in the front of a classroom was something that was missing as a challenge during this time. And then, of course, testing is something that many faculty continue to struggle with. And, in the absence of being able to proctor in person, different tests taking place for the course, faculty needed to figure out what format would be appropriate when managing the classroom remotely. In some cases, some faculty are finding that more of a take-home exam needs to be developed, something where there's an expectation of it being kind of open book and take home. In some cases with our learning management systems, like Blackboard is one that I'm currently using, we were able to develop exams that were appropriate for a remote learning environment. And then there's also some proctoring software that's being used by some faculty, in which the students are able to have their students are able to be monitored as far as their activity, and we're able to see that there's nothing taking place that is inappropriate during an exam. Now, some of the new, if you can go to the next slide, Christina, I'm not seeing the slide shared at the moment, but there are some new challenges that we face as faculty, and one of them is related to security, in which we need to be able to monitor who's in our classrooms and make sure that when we're doing a live online session, that only those students who are enrolled in the class are in the room. You know, we also need to be able to manage who's able to share information, who's able to talk during our class, you know, sharing of screens, and then also monitoring the chats to make sure that nothing inappropriate is being shared. You know, early on, there were faculty experiencing challenges within these areas. And then in addition to being able to teach and manage delivering content to our students, just being able to have an eye on things like the chat room and also the waiting room. So for example, you know, one of the ways that some faculty members manage their courses is that they'll have a waiting room to let people into the room. But of course, it's a challenge to multitask like this while we are delivering content and a message. And you know, it's just something that we've had to navigate during this time. So now I'd like to shift and discuss our next slide if we're able to get this up, and that's related to gender expectations. So for myself, before entering the academic world, I was a business person, you know, and often I found in roles where I was looking to move up in leadership that there were some gender expectations that were kind of affecting the way that I was seen and my ability to move up and get promotions. And so I was often told to kind of hold down some of what was natural to me. You know, I saw it as kind of natural to me as a woman in my nature, where I needed to be kind of a tougher, maybe more aggressive and competitive in order to move into different roles. I've definitely found in academia that I'm able to be more my natural self and, you know, show empathy and caring and not have that seen as a negative. And I especially have felt that during, you know, a time like this, during this pandemic, that, you know, we need to keep in mind that in addition to us as faculty members, you know, experiencing challenges related to using technology and, you know, some of the challenges that we have at home while we're trying to manage our work, that many of these things that Christina, our last speaker, spoke about, you know, have driven the need for us to be empathetic and caring. And I often have to remind myself, you know, after being trained as a business person so many years, to maybe, you know, stifle some of this behavior, that not only is it acceptable for us to be caring and empathetic to students, but, you know, it is almost something that we need to consider that there is a need for during this time, and, you know, just thinking about what students are experiencing. Another area that, you know, many of my colleagues have discussed, I've seen, you know, this topic come up a lot in recent months, is just the impact that this pandemic has had on productivity, especially for parents. And a lot of times the burden will fall on women, but parents in general with small children, it's been a challenge to be able to maintain productivity and both preparing for teaching, you know, actually, you know, having live teaching sessions, and then being productive with research, while at the same time, you know, having children who are not able to go into school and have face-to-face interaction with their own teachers, and kind of looking to parents with a greater need for help with navigating using their own technology for their classes. So this has been another challenge that has increased the stress during this time related to teaching. And this actually ties into my next topic, my last topic here, and that's related to specific challenges for tenure track faculty. You know, for tenure track faculty, you know, there's of course a great focus on being productive with research, you know, doing well with teaching, and, you know, having great feedback with our teaching. And just with some of the challenge that we're facing, it's been hard to keep up with research productivity while navigating what's going on at home and dealing with all these changes that need to take place to manage our classrooms remotely. But in addition to that, we also have these fears related to, our own health and keeping ourselves healthy during this time that can be scary, as well as our family members. And if we have any, of course, underlying conditions, or we have a family member that does, these have been additional stresses and concerns we've had to face. But I have, seen this come up as a topic with colleagues, and, a consideration for myself, even as a tenure track faculty member, that, sometimes we don't want to, speak up, and we care about the politics if we've maybe been asked to come back and speak in the classroom, or, go into an environment that during this time might feel, somewhat concerning, just related to the current pandemic. And so there's this balance, and it makes it tough when you're in that position as a tenure track faculty member to balance that need for keeping your family and yourself healthy, but also meeting the needs of the organization that you're looking to gain tenure at. So those are, some of the, key challenges I wanted to discuss related to what we will experience as faculty members. Of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty, related to when the world will go back to normal. But, over time, we are, learning the right tools that we need to help us to manage in this situation, and, kind of adapting to this new normal. But of course, that there's a certain level of stress that's still there.
Thank you, Angela. Claire, if you could talk to us about accreditation.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So, in these times, there's so much uncertainty and requirement of flexibility. So really, what is the role of accrediting bodies at this time? So normally, pre-COVID times, there is a requirement that a program that delivers at least 50% of its content through distance education actually has to be accredited specifically for distance education. But the Department of Education has actually waived that requirement under the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students, or HEROES Act. And normally, you have your regular site visits, and now they're offering the possibility of fully virtual site visits. And these are optional. These can be done through a combination of video conferencing and telephone. But also, if a program ends up taking this option of a virtual visit, it must be followed up by an on-site visit, including with student interviews within a reasonable time frame. If you could go to the next slide, please. So as effective July 1st next year, we see the distance learning and innovation rule. There's several components to this rule. You're welcome to look at them online. I can add the link to the chat in a little bit. But one of the things that's particularly relevant to distance education is that clock hours have been clarified to include both synchronous and asynchronous delivery of portions of programs, because we know that as faculty, we have shifted and expanded to both synchronous and asynchronous delivery. Something for us to really consider also is transparency. So for example, I teach in a nursing program. And so oftentimes, students are navigating decisions that we make as faculty. So I think it's really important for us to be transparent as possible about the regulatory landscape that shapes the decisions that we as faculty make. And then something that's really an interesting opportunity for us in these times is to really look at how student affairs and academic affairs really embody and operationalize shared goals. Normally, oftentimes it can feel like we're ships passing in the night, but really now, given all that Christine and Angela have shared with you already, we see that these are such tumultuous times. And so how might our knowledge of how students are experiencing maybe detachment from each other, or not feeling belonging within their programs, or feeling such stress or distress, how might that also impact the need for student affairs programs to reach out in a particular way? And how might relationships that student affairs sponsored programs also influence what faculty know and share, influence how we approach our pedagogy? So this is really a unique opportunity for us across our campus divisions and departments to really come together to say, what are our shared goals? How are we meeting our institutional learning outcomes in a united front type of approach? So that's very brief. I just want to bring in the role of accreditation and the regulatory landscape. And so that's it for my portion.
Claire, can you talk to us just briefly about the impact that it is having, the accreditation and the shift in our online environment to our marginalized students, our students of color?
Sure, absolutely. So when we think about accreditation and we think about how we are upholding institutional learning outcomes, what is the role in particular when it comes to equity gaps, when it comes to gaps in graduation? How many years does it tend to take students to graduate or transfer students to graduate? So I think an important role here within accreditation and impact on students of color and various minoritized students is really what are the existing infrastructures for data collection? I think institutional data collection is really valuable at this time. How are we as a faculty also talking about students who are struggling? Are we coming to our discussions in our committee meetings or faculty meetings with deficit frameworks? Are we shifting discussions about maybe inequitable access to high quality Wi-Fi and turning that into maybe underhanded character judgments? So I think there's a lot in terms of how we as faculty discuss. This is also an opportunity for us to consider the infrastructure of higher education. I remember when we first shifted to remote learning, I saw in the news there are a lot of reports of campuses from middle school all the way through graduate school saying, here, come to our parking lots and you can utilize our Wi-Fi. So this is really an opportunity for us to consider the particular impacts of divesting from safety net programs, divesting from families. And so those are some things that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Claire. Ricardo, can you talk to us about some tools and strategies?
Yes, I can. So I have the wonderful task to wrap everything up with all the issues that we are discussing to our audience today. And the one thing I just want to say is when we started planning this session, we titled this program Multiple Frontlines because as we started sharing knowledge and talking about our experiences, as you heard, a lot of this does connect to faculty issues, student issues, and as Claire mentioned, accreditation. And so how do we pull all of this knowledge and learn from it? And especially for faculty, how can we use this knowledge to our teaching and our roles on campus? And so just know that during the pandemic, we were all introduced to online learning and teaching, whether we wanted it or not. And so what I'm going to share with you is information and some ideas, some advice on making your online learning spaces more culturally responsive. And I'll also just share a few strategies that comes from my 6 years of teaching experience in a fully online graduate program. And so I thank you, NCORE, for allowing me to share some of this knowledge. And I welcome also any advice that you may have from your experience, either before the pandemic or after. And so one of the things that I want to bring to everyone's attention is this idea of how do we communicate in these spaces. Now, you might want to take a look and maybe do a little mini audit of your Blackboard space, your LMS space, wherever you teach your online courses, and ask yourself, how am I communicating my knowledge and my information to my students? Some research that is looking at communication in these online learning spaces frequently note that a lot of the communication is heavily based on written communication. Now, I emphasize written communication because one of the things that is missing when you're just relying on text and words in your online learning spaces is that there's a certain sense of anonymity when you only have that in your learning space. I've talked to some of my colleagues on my campus when we were going through this transition, and some of the colleagues didn't even know how to put a profile picture on their Blackboard space. And that just further reiterates the anonymity that that space could potentially have. And so you want to look at how you're communicating within those spaces, and you might want to start thinking about how can I use things like visuals and other means to create not only connection, but to start building relationships. And so what I will encourage all of you to think about is your online learning spaces missing that what we call nonverbal communication? And what I mean by nonverbal communication, I'm talking about even producing an audio of yourself talking to your students. Do your students hear your vocal tone, your certain raise of pitch, and even emotion? And so when we think about nonverbal communication, we're not only talking about how students hear you, but if you really want to go further, I would encourage you to think about adding video. Video and audio allows students to start hearing and seeing that nonverbal communication, which is so important, especially for students who come from cultures that rely on high context communication. I am a Latino male, and if you would see me talking, I would be speaking with my hands. I do a lot of body gestures, and my students even tell me when they see a video of me, they really appreciate like my how I animate myself when I'm speaking. Okay, so you know, while that is a cultural sort of characteristic of my communication, when I started teaching online, I started to realize that that nonverbal piece is allowing not only for me to connect with my students, but my students are in return becoming more engaged in my online learning space. And so as you see underneath the high communication bullet point, there's an idea of visual cues and relationship building. And so research in online learning and teaching does emphasize that when your online spaces include videos where students can see your facial gestures, audio or video where students can hear your vocal expression, and even the body movement, that connects to our students who do come from diverse, culturally different backgrounds, because that is part of their communication style. But it does connect to all students when you think about it. And again, it's all about not creating that anonymous space where online learning frequently has that misconception and that stereotype that, you know, there's no personalization in an online space. And so I've already told you that I use a lot of videos, and one reference that I would highly recommend that's very current. In fact, Karen Costa's book that you see on this slide was published just right before the pandemic. And it is called 99 Tips for Creating Simple and Sustainable Educational Experiences. And so the book is exactly that. It's 99 tips. Some of it is very practical oriented. And the thing I appreciate is some of her tips are heavily influenced by theory and the research. And so it's not a theoretical book, but she does use theoretical frameworks for some of the strategies. And so some of the things that I got from that book, I am currently using, or I have used since last semester to this current time. One of the things that I found useful is what's called video introductions. Now, I realize we're already, for many of us, we're already past the midpoint of the semester, but it's never too late to do this, to be quite honest. But as we start preparing for our fall semester, you might want to consider creating a video introduction. My video introduction is basically me talking to my students via my webcam and posting that video in my learning space and for whatever course that I'm teaching. And so that introduction, again, pretty much gives a little bit of background, much like what you heard in our introduction bios for the beginning of this webinar. And it also includes some additional information that I shared with my students. For example, I'm a coach for a running club, and I make that part of my introduction so that students could get to know me beyond the learning management system space, the online learning space. And so video introductions is sort of the first key element of building a relationship. And if you can start thinking about doing that for your next semester classes, you know, the video doesn't have to be long. My video introductions are usually about 5 or 10 minutes long, but it does do a nice introduction of yourself to your students. When I start going into my modules throughout the semester, especially for my master's level courses, I do what's called a weekly overview. And my weekly overview is, it starts each weekly module in my online course. And Karen Costa, the book that I just referred, she doesn't call it a weekly overview or a weekly module introduction video. She calls it, this is your greetings at the door. And I like that terminology because it basically is that, you know, your students each week are going to your space, and what better way to call that space than a front door to their learning. And so that greetings at the door is me, again, speaking to my students, and I just give them my general thoughts of the content that they will be covering for that week or for that unit. And so included in that greetings at the door, I also include my own sort of connection to the concept. If I have a story to share, that's the moment to do it. And any other information to further engage my students and to further connect my students to the topic. And so again, the students see me talking to them. Many times my greetings at the door are filmed at my home, and so they get to see my home office. Sometimes my dog, my beagle, makes an appearance. And so, you know, again, it's all about building relationships and breaking down that anonymous barrier. One thing that does take a lot of effort is my third idea. And again, the book, Karen Costa's book, does mention this. Not for every assignment, but for some major assignments, I do what's called video feedback or video feed forward. That's my own terminology, by the way. So instead of just providing, again, written communication on comments or critiques of students' work, I provide a 3-minute, about a 3 or 4 minute video where I give feedback to the students on that major assignment. Now, it does take work, I'll be quite honest, but if you're willing to do the effort and to put the time in for maybe at least one major assignment, I've done this for about 3 years now, giving some video feedback on some major assignments. And I tell you what, my students always give very positive feedback when that occurs. In fact, for my current doctoral class, I'm teaching a leadership class for doctoral students. I gave a personal feedback feed forward video on a discussion board, or excuse me, on a discussion project that the students did. And a wonderful thing has happened. The students continued their discussions on the topic with me because of my video feedback. It was an unexpected outcome, but I'm seeing that happen, at least for doctoral students, that when they hear my feedback, they want to continue talking to me, quote unquote, and they want to respond to how I saw their presentations. And again, it's just another wonderful way to create that relationships and to do communication beyond written text. And so the next bullet point is what we've all been learning since March, and that's Zoom pedagogy. And pedagogy, again, is teaching practice. And so the ideas that I have in this section comes from research that myself and another colleague in my department, Dr. Paula Eaton, have done on research in teaching diversity classes in an online environment. And so from what our research says is that if you teach online, try to have at least 1, maybe 2 synchronous class meetings, because those live class meetings, guess what? At least our students, our sample told us that when they have that synchronous meeting, even if it occurred one time during the semester, it allowed them to create community with their fellow classmates. And so I know we all do sort of like hybrid now, or we meet during our class times in a Zoom environment. But if you are thinking about teaching a fully online class, think about synchronous class meetings, because again, that creates community. Effective use of space. Now, there's a lot of tools that Zoom has that even I'm learning as I'm continuing to teach on Zoom. Things like small breakout rooms, using whiteboards to further engage students in the synchronous class meeting. For my classes, I even go beyond the LMS and use things like Padlet, Flipgrid, and other collaborative communication spaces to, again, further engage my students. Just know that teaching online does have its challenges, especially if you are teaching a class that relies on, talking about current issues. And when you're teaching in an asynchronous environment, know that students do appreciate it when you allow the real-time issues, such as the social justice marches that occurred during the summer, the current political elections. Try to include that in your asynchronous learning as much as you can, because again, based on our research in online diversity classes, students responded very well when that occurred. Now, we talked about academic honesty, and this isn't going to take too much of my time, but just know that it is an additional challenge when you are providing a culturally responsive teaching online space. And just know, if you want to have critiques of the different tools that are used in online spaces, things like Safe Assign, Turnitin, and all the plagiarism type things that are used for that particular teaching issue, just know that there are some critiques or some criticisms on even using those services. And because, if you're going through a social justice framework, know that corporations are benefiting from students turning in their data, their papers and things like that. And so you might want to research those plagiarism tools, and just know that in the social justice world, there are some that question the use of those services, because again, those companies are benefiting from the work of our students and even ourselves. What I do in my online spaces when I give exams is I kind of just give a nice simple statement that students agree not to cheat. And yes, I do put the fear of God in them when I put that statement up. That includes possible exclusion from the program. But it is a simple way to just kind of remind students that, during this time, we work on the honor code, and we do want you to know that we do pay attention to things like academic dishonesty, and we want them to only succeed during this very challenging time. So the next slide, I believe, are some resources that we have.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Ricardo. Here is our contact information. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just have a conversation with all of our panelists. I do have a couple of follow-up questions for them. So if they want to go ahead and turn on their cameras. One of the questions that many of us face is in terms of cameras on or cameras off in class, and how do you handle that? And how does that look, and why do you handle it in that way? So if, Ricardo, you want to start?
Yeah, where I'm joining you from today is from my campus office, and usually when I speak to students in my video feedback and my greetings at the door videos, it is at home. And so I understand the challenges that come with students thinking about, well, how much of myself in the Zoom environment do I want to expose, not only to my peers, but to my professor, and how they're going to read that. Well, the way I do that is I'm just an example of I don't care. You know, my home office is kind of in disarray. There's a lot of mementos and things like that that are behind me. And so if I show my students that I'm comfortable in exposing sort of my messy home office, I'm hoping that again, that it breaks down that barrier, but I truly understand the issues, and I don't have a, you have to show your screen all the time policy. Again, I try to start early with letting students know my expectations and understanding. But again, if you work ahead of time and you do things like the introduction video, they get to hear you, see you, and know that, you know, you're kind of a laid back person, hopefully. You know, either they'll feel more comfortable in the decision that they make, or they may allow themselves to think, well, it's not such a big deal. But I truly know and heard of that particular issue.
Angela, would you like to elaborate?
Oh, sure. You know, I think it creates a more interactive environment when the students' cameras are on, and I feel like, okay, I'm not really alone here. It just kind of creates that more interactive environment. But, you know, I definitely think we need to keep in mind some of the things we've talked about today, where, you know, maybe there's something going on at home, or maybe someone's little brother's in the background doing their work and they're sharing a space where it's just not conducive to them turning on their screen. So what I do is when there are times where it would be beneficial for them to have their screens on, I mention that, like if we have a guest speaker and I'd like them to turn on their camera when they're asking a question or interacting with them, or when I'm holding a session, like a negotiation session, I ask that they do that, but I do mention that I understand in some cases they're not able to.
Thank you. Claire?
Yes, so I'm also pretty flexible and try to be very transparent with students. So similar to what Angela just said, when we have a guest speaker, I ask all students to turn their camera on, even if it's just briefly, so that we can see each other. And then I say, if you feel more comfortable with turning it off, then that's fine. I do make sure that we have different ways to interact with each other. So through Padlet or through the chat or through polls. So even if students are, you know, they keep their video off, we're still interacting, and I know that they're still engaged.
Thank you. So Claire, I'm going to ask you, we're going to start this question with you. How do we help students feel comfortable in discussing social justice in an online format where you may not be able to, where you're not as able to engage and sometimes see their reactions, especially if their cameras aren't on, and make sure that they feel comfortable in engaging in that kind of conversation?
Right, I appreciate that question. So something that's I have the privilege of having in my nursing program where I teach is that I am literally working with students from semester 1 through 5. So I have the opportunity and responsibility to build relationships. So I think for when we think about the importance and relevance of social justice topics, part of it is really how do we engage in relationship building? How do we protect certain levels of safety? So if you were to use a Padlet at the beginning of your course or at the beginning of a particularly controversial seeming topic, make sure it's anonymous. So then we can say, you know, what do we all see here? And then you can scaffold the level of maybe removing anonymity a little bit and doing breakout groups with just pairs of students. But really, I think part of it is the importance of praxis, of shifting from not just individual reflection and how we feel about something and our experiences, but tying that to what are our disciplinary goals. So I think those are some things, and I know Ricardo and Angela have a lot of great things to add.
Yeah, one of the things that was going through my head when you were mentioning like using Padlet and establishing relationships is, you know, that first few weeks or that first few modules in your online courses are so important to create that community because you're going to find out whatever you did early in the semester is going to impact how much students not only engage, but how genuine they are when you bring up those topics that involve social justice and, you know, again, real-time issues that are occurring in the US or in the world that need to be discussed in your class. And so I really do try to pay attention to what's happening, especially during the first 2 weeks of my class, to allow students to build that community. I usually schedule far in advance a first synchronous class meeting if I'm teaching an online class, or a class that is fully online, because I want students to get to meet each other, to understand where they're coming from, where they're calling from. And I usually have that first synchronous meeting to have some sort of activity that allows them to, again, get to know each other a little bit better.
And for myself, I'm getting into some areas of social justice related to my research, but in my teaching, it is a lot of these core business school courses, and then courses specifically in the area of supply chain. But I'm actually absolutely seeing how in this online environment, you're able to get students more comfortable with sharing as you're introducing this early in the semester, maybe having them go into breakout rooms and teams to talk about different topics. So I've seen that, especially in negotiations where students are often uncomfortable, speaking or getting into a role early on in the semester. So I can see how it would also apply where throughout the semester, the more that they are doing this and getting used to doing this electronically and online, that they would get more comfortable with it.
Thank you. Can each of you share some lessons that you have learned in this switch to the online or remote learning that you've learned and you would like to share, so that some of us can learn from your mistakes so that we don't make the same ones? So Angela, would you like to start?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is I've always done a few classes throughout the year that are online, but most of my courses were in that traditional face-to-face teaching. And so there were many types of courses that I really kind of had a closed mind to being options for online teaching. And so, being forced to figure out how to teach these different interactive subjects using the technology that's available, I realized, I was wrong, that, I should have been more open to what type of learning can take place online, and that, with experience, we get better with using the technology to facilitate that. So I think that was a big learning for me. And I think my big one was negotiations. That's one I never would have imagined could have been taught effectively online, but I really found that, with the right technology, I'm able to facilitate that. I think that was a big learning for me, to kind of be open to the different technology that can help me to do things different with teaching students.
Thank you. Ricardo?
Again, I come into this conversation with 6 years of teaching in a fully online program. And so with that said, I'm still learning each semester how to better teach in an online space. So the first thing I would advise everyone is you're not going to learn everything in one semester. If you just started teaching online in March because of the pandemic, and you're going to have a lot of learning ahead, but your online teaching is going to get better. The one thing that I learned is Zoom fatigue is real. The students do, there comes a point where students are just like, I totally get it. Mentally and physically, they're exhausted. I had, over the summer, I had the wonderful opportunity to teach an evening class that started at 7:30 in the evening. And these students were already working and coming into the class after working, 8-hour shifts on their campuses. And so what did I do and what did I learn? I encourage my students to get out of their chairs. I usually start a class by, telling them something like, what's your favorite snack? Go get it right now, and get them physically out of their chair to wake them up. And so, just realize that Zoom fatigue is there and try to find creative ways to fight it. And then I do something that I call stop, look, listen. I spend usually the first 5 minutes of any online class where I just don't talk about class. We could talk about the weather. We could talk about meditation. Like what was something you saw in nature today that made you go, you know, just something like that. And I'm finding out, especially during this time, students really just like that little pause button, even if it's for 5 minutes, you know, try it out. You know, students may kind of think, what is he doing? But I think in the most part, most students, eventually all students are going to appreciate it.
Very good. Claire?
Yeah, so depending on the size of the class, I always play music. So students come into a place with music, and sometimes I'll even ask students, you know, what are songs that make you feel like yourself? So I'll cue those up. I also begin every class with a check-in. So whether that's students popcorning to each other, so it's not just awkward silence, they pick each other, you know, who's gonna go next. And the check-in questions are always, how are you doing right now? And then the second question is something that connects the students to the materials that we're gonna discuss that day. And based on how students are feeling, I might do a grounding exercise, breathing, visualization, something like that to help us feel ready. And I hope that that's something that they'll also end up doing with their colleagues and classmates and patients. Something else that I've learned is the importance of communication, whether it's communication when things change with the students, whether it's communication with fellow faculty. Let's get on board about our deadlines and assignments this semester, more so than maybe we would have in the past because of the amount of stress students are going through. And also in our roles as faculty advisors, I'm seeing the importance of really reaching out to students to see how they're doing, even beyond, you know, in a given course. And then finally, what is the role of maybe a standard check-in survey, maybe mid-semester or midterm, that we can do with students to really see how they're doing, so that the work of assessment and relationship building is across semesters or across courses. So those are some things that I would add.
So we do have a few questions from our attendees, and one of them is, can you give some advice about negotiating the differences as it relates to time zones in the synchronous format? So it's in particular with international students. So what advice would you give as it relates to negotiating those differences in time zones during synchronous classes?
I can get started with this. You know, one of the things that I do is for any live sessions that I have, because I have a mix of some live Zoom sessions as well as some recorded lectures on certain topics. For any live sessions, I record the session. If I'm going to have a guest speaker in, I get their agreement or approval that I'm allowed to record them. And so if anyone is in a situation where they're not able to attend live, they can still have access to the content. So that's a big thing that I do. I'm also currently teaching an executive MBA class where we have an evening Zoom call because many of the students are currently in, you know, working in business. And so we do that in the evening. In that case, I don't have anyone who's out of the country, but I schedule it based on their work hours in the evening, you know, considering, okay, I might have West Coast, East Coast, and find a time for that everyone is agreeable to, that they're able to attend.
Okay.
I try to schedule those synchronous class meetings as early as possible. And so even before the semester starts, I send like a doodle poll out to the students with the week I think I would want to meet and try to get on their calendars as soon as possible. In my years of teaching, I really haven't encountered too much of a problem. If I did that far in advance, usually all the students attend the synchronous meeting. And that includes a student a few years ago that was in the Middle East. He actually joined the synchronous classes at 3 a.m. his time, but he was okay with that. He wanted to be, again, part of the community. But he only did that because I did that in advance. And I think that particular student noticed or recognized the benefit of joining his peers at that time. But much like my colleague Angela, I always recorded the sessions for those that can't meet. And even though I say mandatory, I'm okay. I'm softy. Just tell me what it is and I'll share the recording with you.
Claire?
I know, I would just echo everything Ricardo and Angela just said.
Okay, thanks. So can you talk to us about, Ricardo and Angela, you both talked about recording your lectures and then sending them out. Is there any concern with the recordings, how they may be interpreted, how they may be played in pieces and parts, as opposed to being portrayed as you originally intended them to? Do you have any concerns?
You know, I'm still kind of learning in this space. So that's actually something that I have not considered or been concerned with or really dealt with at all. I've just, you know, shared them, and I suppose the students could take that material and do something else with them, but that is something I haven't addressed.
I usually place my videos in YouTube. I have my own YouTube channel, but those videos are unlisted. And so if you're a student of mine, you will have those links. And I usually share a handout with my videos. And on that handout, it does state that this presentation and the material is only for class purposes. And so, you know, I just try to find ways to let students know that, one, this is only for class, including the video link, and my handout is for class purposes. And so that's my strategy.
Okay, Claire? Okay.
Yeah, I would actually say I approach it very similarly to Ricardo.
Okay,
Mhm.
very good. So Tyler has a question as it relates to, he says that many of the math teachers that they work with are quite traditionalist and resistant to any changes in math assessment. They want to continue with the same closed booked, timed, procedural kinds of questions that they use in person. But given the current situation, do you have ideas about how we can assess math online and in a culturally responsive way? So there's a two-part to that question. One is how can we assess math online? And the other is how can we assess it in a culturally responsive way?
You know, I was just going to say, you know, related to the first part of the question, I think I can kind of speak to something I found helpful in talking to others, because I teach this QBA, quantitative business analysis class, where I have, you know, math type problems that relate to the business world. And, you know, I found that using my learning management system, it's been a good way to assess students through online teaching by building blocks of questions. And, you know, they can differ in some way, and kind of having randomness within those blocks to assess students. They can come in a variety of formats, whether it's a multiple choice or having a box for them to kind of show how they've worked out a problem. But I found that to be an effective way for me to deliver these courses without, in the absence of being able to proctor them, you know, kind of using this randomness and you know, presenting questions.
And most of my classes don't have, like, I don't teach statistics, but one thing that I know statistics isn't math, but anything related to quantitative learning, I guess my answer to the first question would be to read the research. A lot of, even before the pandemic, there's an emerging field of scholarship, digital pedagogy, that is growing. And in the lens of NCORE, as it was mentioned in my bio, there's even critical digital pedagogy to see how LMS and Blackboard and the online learning spaces can create spaces of emancipation and social justice for our diverse learners. With that said, you know, I would encourage to have your colleagues check on the scholarship to see how their field is taught in the online space. And for the relationship building, or at least for the second part of the question, again, emphasize how you're building relationships with your students, because they're already coming to the class, even if it was face to face, with anxiety. You know, I think many students do have that math anxiety, but one thing to tackle that anxiety is just to let the students know, hey, I understand, I'm a person too, and to validate their feelings, and then to, again, break down those barriers. The additional challenge is how you're going to do it in the online space. And again, I do just another recommendation of showing presence of yourself in video format or in other ways is going to help you with that particular part of that question.
And I'll add, so when I, reading your question about tests and exams, I wonder, are those high stakes? Are these courses where 2 exams end up comprising your entire grade for that course? So I would really encourage the use of, multiple ways for students to demonstrate learning, including group work, collaborative work, things like that. And then the something thing that I'm wondering if I'm reading it between the lines is, how do we introduce and encourage change within and among our colleagues? And so this, again, we can see the pandemic and what's happening right now as a portal for change, if we want to quote Arundhati Roy. So maybe this can be a way for us in our departments to refresh our awareness of the scholarship out there. Let's see what's out there. Let's gather for half an hour to talk about this article and think about how we can apply and continue improving in our own pedagogies and our collective kind of approach to learning in our departments. So those are 2 things that stood out to me from your question.
Real quick, Claire, I'm so glad you said that, because about a year ago, I was part of a meeting of scholars in higher education, and I'm not going to name the scholar, but we had a conversation about teaching, and the comment was made that, this particular individual could never teach online because, again, the misperception of being anonymous and not having that personal touch that he only saw in the face-to-face. This was a scholar that I looked up to, and of course I had to challenge that, because at that time I was 5 years into online teaching, and I wanted to just really have a deeper dialogue with that person to do exactly what you said. We have to start letting our seasoned or our expert scholars to know that this is an exciting time, to be quite honest, to really reframe and to look differently at how students learn and how we use these online spaces. And again, I do a shout out to digital pedagogy. There's even a digital pedagogy lab that's produced every year to learn more about online teaching, but from very creative and innovative ways. And that's where I learned a lot of my skills and practices that I share today.
So how do we start those conversations with our seasoned scholars and making sure that we are still respectful? How do you propose we start those conversations?
Well, so I can give a brief example from my program right now. So as of May, when things started really happening in terms of just exacerbation of social justice issues, I actually sent out an email to the chair of the department and the chairs of all of our different committees saying, how can we address racial justice? How can we dismantle racism in nursing in particular? And since then, a group of us just informally who support each other, have conversations, said, how can we bring this intentionally and systematically into our department? So now we have a Dismantling Racism in Nursing Education Task Force. So we met informally and we drafted a proposal that we brought to the faculty meeting. We didn't ask for permission. We just said, this is something really important. What is our role in these times? And so now we're doing, engaging in strategic planning. But a lot of it has to do with making our case, presenting the evidence, and sharing our goals, and inviting everyone to come along the ride with us. So that's what I'll share.
That's great, Claire. Angela or Ricardo, do you have suggestions?
my colleagues know I like to play, play with technology. And I say that intentionally because, again, the scholarship in critical digital pedagogy emphasizes the word play. And so the only way we learn new things, remember when we were kids, the only way we learned things about the world was likely through when we were on the playground or when we were playing with our friends. And so the idea of play needs to be emphasized with this reframing of teaching and learning, especially in online spaces. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against face-to-face. You know, I duly really appreciate face-to-face teaching, but you know, we have to prepare ourselves for the next generation of learners who are already quote unquote playing with this technology. You know, the Google headsets, taking virtual field trips and things. And so, you know, we have to encourage our seasoned colleagues to think about the future because we're already in it. We were forced in it, and we have to figure out and learn ways to embrace technology because it's here. And now more than ever, we have to embrace it and know what's out there.
And just one quick example that I saw that I thought was helpful, you know, to those who really had never been exposed to some of the ways that we can use technology and even how to approach online teaching was, you know, within my university, within the business school, each department needed to designate one point person. You know, there was always at least one faculty member who was very comfortable in this space. And actually for my department, they had chose me just because I had been doing some online teaching where, you know, others who wouldn't, who have never done this before, instead of them having to go through maybe some frustrations with going to a help desk for different types of systems or different technology, they could come to me and kind of talk through, here's how I'm thinking about doing this and transitioning it from the way I do it in person in the classroom to an online space. Does that make sense? And so, you know, just having that point person, kind of a buddy for each department, you know, helped. So I think that was a nice technique that was used by my school.
Do each of you feel as though you've gotten enough training or that there's enough training available at different institutions to help faculty transition? Because one of the things that is different in the online space, if you haven't taught online classes and now you're doing remote learning, is as a professor, you were the one that was in charge. You knew your lessons. You were able to stand up and be confident, but now I'm asked to switch modalities and I'm not as comfortable. So how am I appearing in front of my class? I don't feel as comfortable and they're knowing more things than I do. So then I may not look as seasoned as I should. So thoughts, comments about that? Angela, do you want to start? Or go ahead, Ricardo.
Oh, well, I just wanted to give a shout out to my university's online support services. Sam Houston State University, you know, I came into this faculty job with limited knowledge, and even within my first year, you know, I attended a lot of the support workshops to teach online because, again, our program, our master's program, is fully online. And so if your university, hopefully post-pandemic, your university will start looking at how to enhance or strengthen those online support services. And again, exploring the innovative technology that can be used for your pedagogy, your practices and teaching. And, you know, just take a look at where your university is at with the online learning. And I do know some universities need more help than others. But again, as my colleague Claire said, this is a great moment to really encourage shifts and to really talk about change, because I think upper level administration is now going to listen to it and, you know, to face the next crisis.
This can also be a time when we're learning from each other as well and letting our students see that they too can have some responsibility in part of their learning. So Angela?
Right. I was just going to say that, I think it will depend on, the institution that we are with. But, I definitely saw that in my case, we did have a distance learning certification where this is something that the university had provided previously, but they just didn't offer it very often. And so as soon as in the spring, when everyone needed to get up to speed and up and running online, they did increase the frequency of offering this training. But I almost felt overwhelmed, I would say, in the beginning, because there are so many different tools that you can use, and the providers of those tools and technology will often have training sessions that they'll provide to those who they want to use their technology. But it was kind of like the whole fire hose thing, with so much training coming at me, trying to figure out what I was going to use for the classes. So I think it's out there, especially for those third-party tools that you're thinking about using, like some of these proctoring softwares, and there are a number of different ones that you can kind of tap into and use externally. But yeah, I do think that the training is available, but sometimes it's almost too much, especially in the midst of a semester when you are already trying to just manage the class.
I appreciate that.
And I'll add, sorry, just briefly, something that I've learned a lot just from attending. I feel like I've attended hundreds of webinars, and I learn what it's like to be on the other end from attending those. And to be honest, something that has been really helpful is just trial and error. So, maybe in a class, instead of a Padlet, we'll all get onto a Google Doc together and share. Did that work? Let's try something else. And just being in dialogue with students and just being real that let's try something different and see how it goes.
If each of you had one piece of advice for faculty as well as administration, what would that one piece of advice, what would you give as that one piece of advice to both faculty and administration, or if it was the same piece of advice? So Angela?
Related to
related to learning in the online space. So as faculty members, you may need more time for preparation, or you may need more time to learn some of these tools. So maybe you can't teach as many classes as the expectation once was, because before you had your lessons down, but now you're learning something new and a whole new tool. So maybe we need to think about some course releases, or in terms of the administration, maybe we need some more training. Maybe we need to set some more training aside. Maybe we also might need to think about the classes that we're offering. Maybe we shouldn't offer some of these classes during a certain time until we're able to get a better grasp on it. Because moving and shifting, some of the shifting that we did happened very quickly, as all of you have mentioned, moving from the on-ground to the online format, but some of that material just doesn't shift as quickly. And so you may need some time to develop the curriculum in more of an online format.
I think the thing that comes to mind, and it's really, I think, advice for faculty, is that, I teach a wide variety of types of classes. Interactive classes, more technical classes, and then more seminar type classes. And, I've really found that it's not a one size fit all, where you can maybe say, okay, I use these slides in the classroom, these activities, and I can just, transition this to online. I think, as, Christina has mentioned, that as one of the ideas is that we do need time to figure out, how will I approach this in an online learning environment? Because it's not just, taking it and putting the same thing online. I've had to really take some time to figure out, what would be the best way to do this if I don't have everyone in the classroom in front of me. I think, having time to kind of strategize that up front is crucial.
Thank you. Claire?
Mine is a little bit, I'm thinking about this really broadly, is how can we remind each other and ourselves that we're there for students and for learning? Not necessarily just for teaching, but for learning. So that would be my main, just whether it's in meetings and you have an empty space that is named students, or just some way to really remind us that we're here to support students and the next generations.
Rick, if you could just give us a quick snippet as it relates, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arungu.
Okay, yeah, I'll just focus on the administrative side. I did write an article last year about high impact online teaching and making an argument on why that's important. And I did make a position that for administration to do things like investment in professional development for online educators, to even think about the course load, because when you plan, especially if you're new prep for an online class, it's like double the work because you got to place everything in the LMS, and surprise, surprise, money. We need to really support financially our faculty that are putting that time and investment to make high quality learning experiences. Unfortunately, financially, sometimes that isn't rewarded. But if it is, guess what? Your online teaching is only going to improve to what we're suggesting right now, hopefully double, triple the amount.
Thank you so much. Dr. Arungu?
Thank you so much to our panelists. Please drop a thank you. This was very interesting and very informative. So we want to thank Drs. Ricardo, Christina, Claire, and Angela. We also want to thank our captioner, Marie, and our ASL, Connie Jo. I want to thank my NCORE staff, Kathy, Josephine, and Corey, and everybody who was involved in producing this webinar. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Check out Ricardo's article. Do you want to drop the link to your article? Or maybe you all can contact Ricardo afterwards. Would really love to read that article. I think online teaching is here to stay. Zoom is here to stay. We are in a new world, and most of us have not taught online consistently. So this was a very good conversation. I want to thank everybody very much. I want to remind you that we do have another webinar coming up on the 28th. So if you can visit our website, sign up for that. If you have any questions, contact ncorewebinars@ou.edu. If you want the slides, send an email to that address and you'll receive the slides. Again, for all attendees, this is going to be available in probably 5 to 7 days. It's going to be posted and you have access to it. Thank you so very much, everybody, from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies, and NCORE. Thank you all and have a good evening. Thank you.